Hello, and welcome to another video in my Army series for Wargaming for the Men Who Would Be Kings. In this video, I'd like to talk about the Force Publique, specifically during the Congo Arab War in 1892 and 1893, though a lot of this information is going to hold true earlier and even later in the campaigns in the Sudan. What was the Force Publique? The Force Publique was like a gendarmerie in the Congo Free State. They were not part of the Belgian army. Belgium did not own the Congo Free State. It was the private property of King Leopold. But the Force Publique was part army, part police. They kept order within the Free State, and they protected it from outside threats like the Congo Arabs. They were sometimes harsh. We all know this. It was very brutal. But the Congo was a brutal place no matter where you were, no matter who was running it. That's just the nature of the Congo. The Arabs were pretty cruel. The tribes themselves were cruel. Cannibalism was widespread and widely practiced. Now, the Force Publique was actually recruited from a number of sources. The officers were white Europeans, and the soldiers were Africans, black Africans, and they were recruited from a number of places. Some of the companies were recruited from within the Congo, from within the Congo tribes. Others were houses from what is now Nigeria. There were Zanzibaris recruited, and there were a small number of Liberians and soldiers from Sierra Leone recruited into the ranks. The houses were considered some of the best soldiers in the Force Publique, as were the soldiers from Sierra Leone and Liberia, who the Liberians typically spoke English. The sources I'm using for this are Armies of the 19th Century Africa, Central Africa by Chris Piers, and The Fall of the Congo Arabs by Sidney Langford Hind. And that's a first-hand account of the Congo Arab War. He was there. It's an excellent read. It's very interesting, and it doesn't really pull any punches. It just kind of tells it how it was, and it doesn't really make many judgments. And so I like it. It's a pretty good source. The force was organized into companies with one white officer commanding a company, and the ranks were, for the white officers, Commandant, Captain Commandant First Class, Captain Commandant Second Class, Captain, Lieutenant, Sous-Lieutenant, Sous-Officer First Class, and Sous-Officer. And I'm not sure if Sous-Officer refers to a sergeant, because in Hind's book, he refers to white sergeants who command companies. And so I'm not sure if that means sergeant. I'm not as familiar with French. The ranks for the African soldiers were Sergeant Major, Sergeant First Class, Corporal, Soldat First Class, and Soldat Second Class. I'm not sure how large the companies would have been on paper, but in the field, we can do some extrapolating. A reserve force commanded by Commandant Panthier on October 3rd, 1893, consisted of 6 companies, and then those 6 companies were 400 men. And so the companies are going to be less than 100 in the field, and that seems to hold true. There are other elements that have roughly 5 or 6 companies that are around 400 men. And so the companies, they're going to be less than 100 men apiece. However, the true size of these units on campaign was often much larger. A column of 400 men who were soldiers could really, in reality, be 2,000 people. The white officers, of course, all had servants, and the Askari themselves had servants in the form of their wives, and there would often be multiple, and their children. The hangers-on included porters who would carry the ammunition, the food, and the water, gun bearers, cooks, armorers, carpenters. Professionals like blacksmiths, professional hunters often accompanied these units, and watermen to use the canoes, because that's how they navigated the Congo, was largely in canoes. The porters would usually be drafted from local tribes. They would ask a local chief for a number of men. The chief would give them men, often slaves, would serve in this role. The slaves would really be freed when they were with the Belgians, but they usually didn't run off because there was nowhere for them to run. There was no one to feed them, and so as long as they were with the army, they had some kind of source of sustenance. As casualties racked up, those slaves who had initially served as porters would just end up joining the units, and they would become Askari themselves. Additional soldiers could be recruited in the field from freed slaves and enemy prisoners. Lieutenant Dorm will recruit an entire company of Askari from prisoners taken from the Congo Arabs. They are equipped with weapons that are captured, and they're drilled right there, kind of trying to trained on the march. They're not very good soldiers, but that's what you can expect from people drilled on the march who already surrendered once, many of them. And so they're of mixed quality, but they do supplement their ranks that way. And they did fight well enough that in Dorm's company, many of those men were killed multiple times over, so he replenished the ranks, 3 or 4 times over with these people. He wasn't changing the names, and that's why the same man was being killed 3 and 4 times. The professional Askari were supplemented to a large degree by allied tribesmen who served as auxiliaries. Sidney Langford Hind gives numbers at the outset of their campaign. They had 400 Askari. Gango Lutete brought between 5 and 10,000 men. Lupungu, Kolomni, and Goimuyaso brought 25,000 men of their own. Now, the men under Gango Lutete had around 2,000 guns, between 5 and 10,000 men. The other party of 25,000 men had 3,000 guns, and that was in addition to their 400 regulars and 6 white officers. Now, the between 5 and 10,000 was that those men often fluctuated depending on what was going on. They were not always on campaign on any given day. Sometimes men would not be in the camp. They'd be out foraging, so they weren't part of the fighting strength. They would come and go, kind of as it suited them. Having talked about the composition of this force and where they got their men, let's talk about how they were armed. The Force Publique Askaris were armed with, according to Sidney Langford Hind, chassepos. Now, these could have been Gras as well, and they're simply calling them chassepos. It is a very similar gun, except for the cartridge. They also had earlier, before the Congo Arab War, there were mentions of Snyders, there were mentions of Martini Henrys, even going back further than that, there were muzzle loaders. And after that, I know that the Albini conversions were used, which was a Belgian arm. The tribesmen who are armed with guns, many of them are armed with guns, are armed with percussion muzzle loaders. Sidney Hind refers to them as cap guns, so they're percussion cap muzzle loaders. The Arabs are to a large degree armed with those as well. And as they capture Arab forts and win battles, they're bringing in thousands of arms, and those arms are going right back out to the tribesmen, along with powder and food and all sorts of other supplies. In addition to that, they capture not an insubstantial number of Winchester lever-action rifles and carbines. A lot of the officers do carry the newer small-bore Mausers, but Hind writes that soldiers stopped trusting them as much. The officers didn't trust the weapons as much because they had poor stopping power, and that's something that does hold true with a lot of the early small-bore smokeless cartridges, that they went in so fast, they had such a high velocity that they were just doing through-and-through shots. And a lot of work will be done in the 1890s with the European militaries to increase the effectiveness of the actual bullets that they're firing, to give them better wounding potential, tumbling, and things like that. They also have artillery in the form of 75mm Krupp mountain guns, though usually, and for most of the campaign, the ammunition is in short supply, and so it's husbanded. On October 13th of 1893, they have a Krupp gun, but only 44 high-explosive shells and 12 rounds of canister. In December, they do get a supply of ammunition. They bring in an additional Krupp. They have plenty of ammunition. They also bring in additional breechloader rifles and ammunition to replace those weapons that had been damaged and lost in combat. In the Congo, cavalry just weren't possible. The tsetse fly would bite horses, and within a few weeks they would die of sleeping sickness, and so there were no cavalry, and there was very little artillery because everything that was brought in by porters and on canoes, and so you're limited to what you can actually bring in. The appearance of these forces are, for the auxiliaries, they'd be wearing their standard traditional tribal clothing, supplemented depending on how Arabized any given tribe was by Arab-style clothing. The Askari, as you can see here, were dressed in blue wool uniforms, trousers, and a shirt and a red fez. They were often trimmed at the cuffs, the collar, and the placket. The placket is the part that runs down halfway in the shirt. That's where the buttons are. And so the amount in which they were piped really depended, on the uniform. They were not very standardized. The general look was blue trousers, a blue shirt, and some red trim with a red fez. And they were trimmed to a varying degree. The officers had a white uniform, and they had a blue uniform. And you often see a mix thereof. Lieutenant de Walters is very well known for having worn a white uniform throughout the Congo Arab War, complete with white shoes. They called him the Hare, and he's very famous for that. The officers had both caps and sun helmets, though for both the Askari and the officers, broad-brimmed straw hats were often worn when on campaign. Now on to the quality of the troops. The Askari were pretty good. They had discipline. They were not known to not be very good shots, but in the Congo Arab War, when you read the accounts of the battles, the Force Publique Ascari had discipline. They were able to advance together. Their NCOs took initiative when the officers weren't there, because the officers were very limited. You had one officer per company. So if the company split to do an attack, it would be the sergeants leading, and they took initiative to assault the forts. When Lieutenant De Hoysch is killed, assaulting Rumeliza's fort, it's the Ascari that go near the body, take his body, and withdraw back in good order. And so they were very good soldiers. They often stayed around their white officers when the action was very thick, and it's noted. They're noted for it. Ascari recruited from Congo tribes were known to be excellent scouts, and they knew the culture very well, though many were also cannibals like the Bengala. The Hausas, it just wasn't part of their culture, nor the Liberians or those men from Sierra Leone or Zanzibar. It just wasn't something they really did. But it was a very widespread practice in companies that recruited from native Congo tribes. The tribal auxiliaries themselves did tend to fight pretty well, but they did fight under the direction of their chief. And so if their chief fell out with the Force Publique, they would just sort of leave. Gangolo Tete is a chief they actually fought. They imprisoned, they punished. He joined them again. He was later imprisoned on suspicion of conspiring against them and was executed. And so that sort of thing was not uncommon in the Congo. Many of the tribes had a reputation for being cannibals, and that actually worked to their advantage. The Arabs, being Muslims, and they're really the same for Christians, you don't want your body desecrated. You need your body to be whole, and so those cultures, Christians and Muslims, don't believe in cremation generally. And so the cannibals actually, the Arabs tended to fall back. They didn't want their bodies to fall into the hands of the cannibals and be desecrated like that. And that was a big psychological, as it would be. I mean, I don't want to be eaten myself. And so that really worked to give them a more fearsome, fearsome reputation. And it's also mentioned a lot in Sidney Hinn's book. He has a whole chapter on it. The Belgians did not necessarily encourage cannibalism, especially in time of peace. It caused a lot of trouble. People didn't really want to walk around at night if you thought there were manhunters out there, and some of the tribes were manhunters. But during the Congo Arab War, it was just a necessity. Otherwise, there'd have been thousands of bodies rotting in the sun. There have been flies and disease, and so after the battles, the battlefields were cleaned up, within hours, and people were feasting on the bodies. One of the Ascari in another company gorges himself on flesh so much that he actually dies. He kills himself, overeats. Um, some tribes did not practice it, so like the Azandi, and they were not, as far as I know, present in the Congo Arab War. They weren't cannibals, but they did have a reputation for being cannibals, which added to their fearsome reputation. Though they didn't really practice that. The Baluba tribe did not really eat flesh other than in times of war from fallen enemies, and so to what degree it was practiced really depended on the tribe. Some were absolute just manhunters. They would eat people over goats if they had the option, and they did. And so, kind of getting down to the end all result, what is the character of this army? Well, the Force Publique is more of a police force, kind of something that does internal security. It's not exactly like you'd imagine a European stand-up army, but they are very effective for what they do, and they're quite fearsome. Even having a little bit of discipline made them far more effective than the Arabs, and they could really defeat any tribe they ran into because they did have military discipline, especially those units recruited from like the houses, who were very, very, very well known, very famous for being incredibly fierce warriors. They were pretty well armed with breech-loading arms. They did have some cannons, though they often did not have the amount of ammunition they would like. The tribal forces were also well armed with muzzle-loading percussion muskets, sometimes rifle muskets. They did also rely a lot on spears and shields, their traditional weapons, as well as bows, and sometimes bows tipped with like poison, which is something that Sidney Hinn talks about. And so overall, it's really primarily an infantry force. On campaign, it is overwhelmingly a tribal force. As I said before, 400 Ascari, 25,000 tribals. So if I were to want to represent an army like this in a game of the men who would be kings, well, first of all, the miniatures you're looking at are Wargames Foundry, and so they make a line for this in their Darkest Africa line. But I would represent it with 1 or 2 units of Force Publique Ascari. Preferably 2 to give yourself kind of a hardened core of the army. I'd add a unit of tribal musketmen, so irregulars with obsolete weapons. and I'd fill the rest with tribal infantry wielding spears and shields, and that'll give you a pretty good character of what these armies would have been like during the Congo Arab War. I probably wouldn't add in the mountain gun. You could in larger games, but they really only had two at any given time, and they didn't factor a lot into the battles. They certainly helped, but it wasn't the end all be all. I wouldn't rate anyone as unwilling. They were all pretty good fighters. Maybe the only bad fighters were the Askari companies recruited by Lieutenant Dorm, because they were just hastily trained in the field, and they were actually recruited from men who already surrendered once, and so they really weren't the best soldiers. But everybody else was actually pretty good. If at all possible, I would try to limit my army to having only one white guy in the entire army. Like I said before, you would have an entire company of Askari led only by one white officer. And so that's probably the best, most accurate way to do it. There'll also be a fun army to paint. You'll have a nice mix of straw hats. You'll have a lot of men in mostly blue, but you can vary the amount of red trim they're going to have. Some men are also going to be wearing white trousers. The leather, belts, and cartridge boxes on the Askari can be either black or brown, and so you can have some variation there. It'd just be a cool army to paint. It should play pretty good, and you're really going to have a lot of troops. Once you get that hardened core, really 5 to 10 points of Askari, your other 14 points, you can get a lot of tribals in 14 points. And so in that sense, you're going to have a pretty cool army. It's going to give you a nice mix of regulars and tribals. It's going to be a pretty cool dynamic. This is pretty much it for the video. I wish I had more to say. I would absolutely recommend Sidney Hinn's book. It's not very expensive, and it goes into far more detail in the battles. Something I also forgot to mention, a lot of the battles were fought over fortifications. The Arabs tended to dig in and fight defensively. It never really worked out for them, but that's how they fought. And so it's just something else to think about if you want to generate scenarios. They're going to be, for the Arabs, mostly defensive. And the Arabs will have Winchesters, so you can have some increased volume of fire there. It might make for some interesting scenarios. That's it for my video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.